Internet. Hi, everybody. Mike and Andy here, the World Vox headquarters, Brea, California. It's winter in California, which means it's 65 and sunny. And so all the Californians have been wearing their scarves and mittens and coats. It is so funny. It is so funny, and I cannot help but every year just kind of poke at it just a little bit. It's so beautiful. What is considered a warm spring day in every other part of the world is here frigid and cause for the dawning of all sorts of warm weather clothing.
Oh yeah, 16 years ago, at the heartbeat of my emo hardcore scene commitments, I would have gloves with cut off fingertips and scarves, and long sleeve sweater and all kinds of nonsense.
But that just wasn't a weather statement, though. That was a
there was
another statement.
There is a fashion subculture that heavily played a part of all of that.
So it's 62 right now. It is 62 and sunny in Brea for a high of 68. So it's a little chilly. Here today, gang. So we'll
Watch
see
out
if
for
we
that
can
frostbite.
We'll see. Yeah, we'll see if we can make do. Okay, so a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, 47 of you have joined us on Patreon, and that is absolutely. I am totally blown away and surprised. I think it is fantastic. We are so excited that you would invest and participate in the podcast in that way. I mean, that's a huge deal. Yeah. So we're stoked. And then we got an email from somebody that just said, "Hey, I'd love to support you beyond the Patreon thing. What do you need?"
Yeah.
And so thank you for being willing to do that. So if you go to Patreon, patreon.com, and you look for the Vox Podcast, that's where we're at. We're also located on voxpodcast.com. And as we always say, we have this church that has grown out of the podcast, and that's at voxoc.com. Now, last episode we waded into some murky waters about whether or not we can agree to disagree around LGBTQ issues, and I got some heartbreaking, thoughtful, beautiful feedback about when I just throw around the phrase "I believe in the traditional view" and let people come up with their own interpretation of what that is. Folks in the LGBTQ community will hear that, or could potentially hear that as something I don't intend for that shorthand to convey.
Yeah.
So I had some really wonderful, very tender, kind, but sad people, asking for clarification. What do you mean by this? And we're not going to do that today. But I realized the problem of that sort of shorthand, because the folks I was trying to really talk with were the ones saying, there's no room here to agree to disagree. And so in my mind, I was aiming at that community without realizing our community is so much wider and deeper and broader than that. And so I'm sorry that shorthand let either hurt or let people kind of read into whatever they understand the traditional view to be. So that was a good lesson. That was a great lesson for me, and I won't use that shorthand anymore, which opens up now a whole bunch of, what do you mean, Mike, by the traditional view when you use it but don't want people to read into it? What do you mean? So that's a fascinating conversation for another day.
Okay.
So thank you for those who consistently on Facebook or privately, just provide all sorts of thoughts. I mean, we do genuinely love the conversation, and that's why we try to interact so much more than we used to around emails we get or comments we get or articles we get sent, because you shape the conversation in really interesting ways. And this is another example today, some stuff I want to get into today that we haven't touched on yet.
Oh boy.
Right.
Wait, what have we not touched on yet?
Oh yeah, this one. We've not touched on this one. So this podcast is going to be ridiculously teachy. Ridiculously thick, and tons of nuance. Now, the difference between the book format, which I've written a few books, two of them are good, out of 5, so that's not too bad. Three I'd rewrite in a heartbeat. But you should have them all. You should totally buy them all because they're all incredible.
Which we'll post today at the Vox Podcast.
Yeah, seriously. Well, you need to read them all to determine which two I really like.
Yeah.
The difference between a book format or a sermon format, those are a bit more precise. So if I were writing a journal article, if I were writing a book. When we get into these difficult topics, you're footnoting, you're disclaiming, you're being very precise in your language. I don't manuscript our podcasts, shocking, and so I do a lot of prep work, but I don't manuscript, and so. When we get into these really controversial issues, I will always, at the end of the podcast, just think, oh my goodness, I should have said this. And did I make that clear? And, you open yourself up for all sorts of misunderstanding. So I'm claiming right now the genre-specific rules that govern podcasts versus written books or like technical sermons.
Yeah.
So this is a conversation. This isn't a final word. These are some thoughts I have about a very controversial topic. All right. And so, Andy, one of the reasons why I love having you in the room is that these all hit you fresh. You never know what we're going to talk about, and so I always am hopeful. As you're processing, you're raising things that are kind of in real time that are going through the minds of other people.
Okay.
So, got an email from a brother. Of who and I don't mean brother like in Jesus. I mean the brother of a brother who had shared one of our podcasts, and it opened up some really interesting conversation. Now, this to me is what the genius is about podcasting. Not our genius, but just the podcasting medium. It is so much easier. It's like podcasting is the new inviting to church. It used to be, in the glory days of the mega church era, it'd be like, hey, why don't you come to church with me? It's kind of like that was the big invite.
Right, because everyone was looking for a community to be a part of.
Right. Now, the stories that are so fun for me are the stories where, my brother has this group that he discusses these with, or in this case, I get an email from somebody who said, hey, I shared one of the podcasts with my brother, and because I've been worried that I don't want to be too Christian-y, and then it generated just good conversation between the two of them. And I emailed the one, I said, hey, can I share a bit of this backstory? He said, of course, because the one brother that emailed me shared a podcast with his other brother, and that's opened up conversation. The other brother had said, hey, I'd love to hear some thoughts around the perceived exclusivism around Christianity.
Okay.
So the whole Jesus being the only way, kind of conversation, the perceived exclusivity of Christianity / religion as a whole. Mm-hmm. And I was like, dang, that's not something we've done anything on. So, brothers from the same mother, let's do a bit of talking around this. Now, this is where, I'm pulling from Dallas Willard and N.T. Wright and Mike Erie. And so none of this is footnoted. These are just thoughts that have kind of accumulated over the course of years. So let's talk about the issue of pluralism, right? Pluralism is the understanding that we live and work and engage in a plurality of different believings, particularly around religious things. From there is no such thing as God to nope, there's a God and that God is creation to nope, there's a God, that God is separate from creation. I mean, just the broad, beautiful swath of human belief about religion. We live in a pluralistic culture. Now, that has raised increasingly the further away the United States moves from being a monolithic culture with some sort of Judeo-Christian, roots, the more this becomes an issue, because the traditional view on this is, well, Jesus is the only way to heaven, and unless you believe in Jesus, you will go to hell. And it falls into that story we talked about a couple episodes ago, where you live on earth, and what you do on earth determines your eternal destiny. And the eternal destiny turns out to be around the person of Jesus. And so all of the questions, that naturally raises, what about those who've never heard of Jesus? And what about those who don't get an accurate view of Jesus? I mean, the kid that was molested by the Catholic priest, or the televangelist that had an affair. What are those pictures of Jesus that we're held accountable for? I mean, you get into all these just incredibly huge and massive conversations. So let's spend a little time, if it's all right with you, Andy, on how do we think about this? How do we think about this? Because on the one hand, Christians claim, and most adherents of religion claim, to have knowledge. In other words, we're not just claiming belief. We're not just claiming blind faith. No, we're claiming as a piece of religious knowledge that Jesus was, in fact, he lived. In fact, the testimony about him is captured in some sort of accurate form in the four Gospels, and that as a matter of history, he rose from the dead. That's the standard evangelical line. And we claim those aren't just articles of faith, but that those are pieces of knowledge, that you can actually have an interactive relationship with God through his son Jesus. The Holy Spirit of God resides in you. These aren't the Christian. The standard Christian line isn't that these are just wishful thinkings. These are actually pieces of reality. Now, loads of people will counter and say, no, religion and knowledge don't belong in the same sentence, right? Knowledge comes from science. Knowledge comes from sensory input. Knowledge comes from the application of different aspects of the scientific method. It certainly does not come from religion. Knowledge does not come from religion. So they would depart the plane, right there immediately. So when you get to issues of pluralism, you're embedded also in issues of epistemology. How do we know something's true? And issues of knowledge. Is moral belief or religious belief properly called knowledge, or is it simply belief that has to do with sentiment or tradition or some sort of blind commitment? Not only that, if religious believing is an issue of knowledge, then you have built-in exclusivism, which is the opposite of pluralism. Exclusivism is it's called logical exclusivism. It's when you say something is that something is red. That logically means that it is not white, it is not black, it is not gray, it is not brown. Logical exclusivism is anytime you claim to have a piece of knowledge, anything that claims to have knowledge that disagrees with that is automatically wrong. So when you get to pluralism conversations, if Christians will say, well, if Christianity is true, then by definition, not because Christians are arrogant, or although a lot of us are, or hypocrites, although a lot of us are, or self-righteous, though a lot of us are, it's because there is simply in virtue of something being true, that means that the things that don't affirm that truth are automatically false. Okay, so when we talk about pluralism, often we confuse pluralism with this form of exclusivism, and what I mean by that is this: to say that I think another religion is false does not mean that everything about that religion is false. It just means that because I affirm a truth elsewhere, and this piece of believing over here is contrary to what I affirm, then there is a natural exclusiveness to truth. That's part of the issue. Makes sense? Am I
track with that.
So there is a weak form of pluralism that people can affirm that says, yes, there's truth in every religion. No one religion has exclusive rights to truth. There is truth in every religion. Okay? So that's the weak form of pluralism that kind of honors the logical exclusivity of if something's true, then that means other things are false. Okay? There is a strong form of pluralism that I don't know. I think a lot of people hold this in theory, but it's tough in practice. And the strong form of pluralism is seriously all religions end up to the same place, and it is of no consequence what you believe now. It is of absolutely zero consequence because they all end up in the same place. Now, whether that place is a good place or whether that place is, well, they're just all wrong, that's another topic for discussion. But strong pluralists will typically say either all religions are false or all religions are part of the same elephant. We're just one person's feeling the trunk while the other person's feeling the leg and the other person's feeling the tusk. And so biblically, as an evangelical Jesus follower, and I hate using those terms altogether these days anyway, I can affirm the weak form of pluralism, that I think that there is truth all over the place. But I have a harder time affirming the strong view of pluralism, which is that it doesn't matter. That there's simply, whether it's on an epistemological basis, moral basis, it just simply does not matter what you believe. That's where I go, no, I don't think I can affirm that as a Jesus follower. But I can affirm the weak view. And so I want to put forward something that Dallas Willard calls the Christian view of pluralism. Now I'm not representing Dallas well, nor am I claiming to improve on his work. But this is how I think about it, in the hope that maybe you and your brother and other brothers and sisters out there will be able to get into some good discussions about it. All right?
Okay.
So I have 5 pieces of the beginnings of a construction of how should Christians see the truth claims, the competing truth claims of other religions, the competing truth claims of the atheists and the agnostics among us, so on, so on, so on. When it comes to the question of, well, is Jesus the only way? Do I have to be a Christian to be acceptable before God? I mean, all of those deep questions. All right, are we with me so far?
Yeah.
So, all of this up till this point was intro and sort of background, so that I can use shorthand around logical exclusivism, pluralism, and so on. So, first, a Christian view of pluralism begins first and foremost with love of neighbor. In other words, we treat everybody else the way we would want to be treated. So if we insist on religious freedom, then we must fight for religious freedom for all forms of religion. Correct? Not just our form. Mm-hmm. If we insist on being heard, listened to, and respected, then we must also make room for those of other or non-religious viewpoints to be heard, listened to, and respected. If we insist on being honored, we must give honor. I mean, it's basic, but it gets lost in the middle of who's right, who's wrong, who wins, who loses. Are we at war with Islam, or are we at war with a part of Islam? I mean, it's all of that gets lost in the very clear, simple Jesus command to love your neighbor as yourself. So your Muslim neighbor, your Jewish neighbor, your non-affirming neighbor, your affirming neighbor, just whatever. Love of neighbor is the baseline for anything else that we do, right? We treat people the way we would want to be treated. So that's piece number 1. Piece number 2 is, and we've talked about this one, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. It's that we recognize there's truth, and we claim truth wherever we find it. So the Bible doesn't contain all truth. The standard Christian view is it contains truth, but it doesn't contain all truth. It doesn't contain mathematical truth. It doesn't address lots of moral issues. It does not tell us anything about what was happening in the Far East during the biblical time or in the Americas, contrary to what our Mormon brothers think. We would just simply say that if it's true, if it's good, if it's beautiful, ultimately it can be traced back to God. So I don't have to look at my Muslim brother or sister and say, hey, I believe everything that you believe is false. It's of the devil, it's wrong, it's demonic, whatever.
Right.
No, I think there's a bunch we could affirm. I think that, say with Buddhism, right? The one of the noble truths is that life is out of joint, and the source of its out of jointness is desire. Oh man, how profound is that? Mm-hmm. Can we affirm that? Of course we can affirm that. So to me, the Bible gives us great permission to affirm truth wherever we find it. So these two are just kind of heart postures that we have towards other people. Number one, we affirm whatever we can affirm, wherever we can affirm it, right? Every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights, according to James. And so we affirm goodness and truth and beauty wherever we come across it. And we do so out of love of neighbor. We want our neighbors to flourish. We want them to we want to build towards the common good. We want them to be treated the way we would ourselves would want to be treated. And even if they turn out to be our enemies, we're still called to love, serve, and bless them. So there is no excuse for self-righteousness, arrogance, hypocrisy when it comes to this conversation. Even if you hold the view that, yes, Christianity's right, it is exclusively right, nothing else measures to the same level of rightness, the way we hold that view is to be very Jesus-like. Now, are you with me? I just saw your face say maybe you had something to say. Is that true?
I did. I mean, I have thoughts in my head, but they're not worth contributing at this time.
Some would say that's true most often. So I don't know. We'll be the judge of that once we hear those thoughts.
Yeah. Well, yeah. The first thing was I think it's posture of opinion. It's like thinking, oh, is it when we look at other religions, is it reasonable for us to think that they're just they're incomplete views or skewed views of similar truths? I mean, I think those are just subjective yeses in different ways. But
yes, yes, that's interesting. Let's see if we come back to that.
Okay.
So how should we look at the perceived exclusivism of Christianity? All right. So first, love of neighbor is key. We recognize truth, beauty, and goodness wherever we find it. Now that one is actually controversial in some circles. So we don't have time to defend it, but you can go and listen to our Bible podcasts several months ago, and we talk about how Paul and others were constantly pulling from knowledge beyond their covenant traditions, and using it to argue for the sake of this Jesus. Now, here's where we get a little thick. All right, God's concern. This is piece number 3. God's concern has always been for the nations. In other words, why was Israel chosen? For the sake of the nations. Why did Jesus come? For the sake of the nations. So I want to build a bit of a theology around the nations to show that God's heart has always been for the nations. It's never just been for his people. His people exist for the sake of the nations.
Right.
So the first command, of course, is have sex, fill the earth. Hallelujah. And that the nations were to be blessed. So God calls Abram out of a nation, and he sends them into a land that he doesn't know, and says, I will build you into a great nation. I will bless you. Those who curse you, I will curse. Those who bless you, I will bless. And then there's this beautiful line. All the nations on earth will be blessed through you. So the very first part of the story isn't let me rescue souls and get them into heaven. It's about the blessing of the nations. And this thread goes throughout the scriptures. So one of the things that's affected by the entrance of sin and death into the world in Genesis 3 through Genesis 11 are the nations and their relationships with each other. Now, the nations, of course, back then weren't like nations today. So maybe they were little city states, or maybe they were, a bit of regional power. But even then, the Bible records the fracture of the nations, resulting ultimately in God's judgment of them in Genesis 11, where he disperses them and scatters them with different languages. And we can talk about what that exactly means.
Happened, right?
Yeah. But you start with a theology saying, no, God's intent was to bless the nations, and he intended to bless them after they've been fractured by sin and death, and the earth had been filled with violence. So now the nations, they live, as we see thousands of years later, in a state of violent hostility and division towards one another, right? So war, the number of wars that have happened in the last 20 years, I mean, it's just astronomical. But those are warrings between nations. So evidence of the sin and fracture of shalom is on how the nations now relate to each other. Make sense?
Yeah.
So God then intends to repair the nations, not just the earth, not just individual souls, but the nations. And so you have 3 times in the book of Genesis, the nations will be blessed through you, Abraham. The nations will be blessed through you. The nations will be blessed to you. Israel was called to be a light to the nations. Part of their corporate existence was to be a magnet to the nations to show how beautiful it was to live under the kingship of Yahweh. So that was their purpose. Their purpose wasn't just, hey, you're chosen because I like you more, or hey, you're chosen, you're the in crowd. No, it was chosen for the sake of being a magnet to draw the nations to God. The problem was that that magnet became very ineffective. And in fact, God judges Israel so harshly because he says, you've actually become more corrupt than the nations around you. So he sends the nation of Israel into exile among who? The nations. And he allows the nations to come and to pillage Israel. And so, but it's all nation stuff, right? The concern here is the nations. As Israel is in exile, the promises written by the prophets are that God is going to restore not only Israel, but the nations to their shalom. So you get a passage like Isaiah, where Isaiah chapter 2, in the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established on the highest of mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord. He will teach us his ways. We will walk in his path. He will judge between the nations and settle disputes for many peoples. They will take their weapons of war and beat them into weapons of farming. Right? That's one of the most epic promises. Or Jeremiah. At that time, they will call Jerusalem the throne of the Lord, and all nations will gather in Jerusalem to honor the name of the Lord. Or Psalm 86, all the nations you have made will come and worship before you. So God's concern is with the nations, not just his covenant people. His covenant people exist for the sake of the nations, right? So we flip that just like Israel did. Israel thought their election as God's chosen people meant their uniqueness, their specialty, their exclusivity, their whatever, when in fact it was just the reverse. God keeps reminding them, I chose you because you were the least of all nations, so that the weak would shame the strong, so that the have-nots would shame the haves, right? He always chooses the weakest things to work through. So Israel was the weakest, and there was nothing unique and special about them. So any trace of the posture towards the nations that comes from superiority, self-righteousness, exclusivity is anti-Jesus. Because if you're a Jesus follower, you exist for the nations. You don't exist for you. You don't exist for your family. You don't exist for your personal growth or quiet time. You exist for the sake of the nations. You are to be a magnet, right? What's Jesus say? You are salt and light. You are to exist as a magnet in community. Right? The same vocation given to Israel is now given to the church as a community that's a magnet for people to say, oh, the reign of Jesus as Lord is actually a flourishing, freeing, wonderfully beautiful thing. But we have the same problem. The church now obscures the beauty of Jesus as much as Israel obscured the beauty of Yahweh. But I want you to see that before anything else, God's concern is with the nations, and it's not just with this one small tribe he calls out of human history. Make sense?
Okay.
So this is a huge point.
Yeah, it's massive.
And thank you. So am I. Now, Jesus, this is so beautiful. Jesus runs into a Roman centurion. And the Roman centurion has like 4 strikes against him. Number 1, he's a Gentile. He would be, by some of the Jews of the day, or at least later, considered a dog, considered unworthy of, inheritance to God, any of God's promises. Number 2, he was part of the terrorizing, occupying force. Number 3, he was Roman, and number 4, he was a soldier, but not just any soldier, a centurion, a commander. And he comes up and he says to Jesus, "My servant lies in terrible suffering. Can you come heal him?" Jesus, at this point, very early in his ministry, had a reputation as a healer. So Jesus looks at him and says, "Sure. Shall I come to your house and heal him?" Now, that totally transgresses. Is that a word? Transgresses. There it is. Jewish sensitivities, because a clean and proper rabbi should never go into the house of a Gentile and maintain his ritual purity. The centurion perhaps notices this and says, "No, I don't deserve to have you come into my roof. Just say the word, and my servant will be healed." Right? However many feet, miles, cubits away this was, right? The Roman centurion knew that Jesus had authority, and he knew Jesus had authority because the centurion has authority. So he's like, I know how authority works. I say to this soldier, come here, and they come here, and I say, go, and they go. So Jesus, you have that same kind of authority, but you have it over disease. And so Jesus stops and he says, truly, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. Right? How offensive is that if you're a Jewish follower of Jesus?
Oh, yeah.
And he says, I say to you that many will come from the east and the west. And then in another version of the parable, it's from the north and the south also. And they will take their places at the feast with Abraham at the end of the age, in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom of heaven will be thrown outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now think about what Jesus has just said. What Jesus has just said is he's borrowed on that whole prophetic tradition about the nations to say to the Jews, all right, here is an example of the kind of faith that I've always been looking for. And he is actually the foretaste, the appetizer, the precursor of what will happen at the feast at the end of the age. See, for the Jews, the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that was their heaven. That was, God is going to remake the world, and you will feast. It is a wedding feast with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the patriarchs. And so Jesus comments, I've not found such great faith in Israel, from this Roman centurion soldier, and then says, I tell you, there are going to be a lot more like him sitting around the table.
Yeah.
And all of you who think you're in, man, you're going to be in for a rude awakening. So Jesus says two things. Brilliant. Number one, God's concern, even in Jesus, is for the nations, and that many will come from the nations. But then secondly, the theme of judgment is always tied in Jesus' teaching with the theme of surprise and reversal. Mm-hmm. Who you think is in isn't always in, and who you think is out is certainly not out. And it will be very surprising. So Jesus tells stories about sheep and goats who didn't know that their acts of service were actually done to Jesus, whereas the folks that refused to do acts of service were actually rejecting Jesus. Jesus tells a story about the rich man who lived in luxury on earth, and the poor man who lived with sores outside of his gates. But in the age to come, their fortunes are reversed. I mean, Jesus is always talking about the reversal of fortune, the surprise. The first will be last, the last will be first. You'll be shocked. But in this instance, he uses the nations. And the nations around Israel at this time were Assyria and Egypt and Rome and Babylon.
Yeah.
And so these are four classic enemies and oppressors of Israel. So when you think of those directions, those are the nations you're thinking of. And Jesus is looking you straight in the face saying, there will be people there from there. People in the kingdom of God from these places. I mean, and you're just like, oh my goodness. And then, if that weren't enough, you have this picture at the last book of the Bible in Revelation 21, where it says there is the tree of life, which is a reference to a tree that was in Eden, and that its leaves, it says this very specifically, its leaves are for the healing of the nations, which one of my favorite lines. Now, my point, see, some would think, well, what's this have to do with anything? The reason there'll be so many people coming from every tongue and tribe and nation is because Christian evangelists have done their work. That's the reason. And I'm like, absolutely. I have no problem with people sharing their faith, and some of the ways we've done it, I have problems with. But in terms of no, I mean, we're to be witnesses to the glory and the power and the reality of the Lord Jesus. Okay, great. I have no doubt about that. But this is piece number 4.
Yeah, you're on 4.
And this is where it gets a little sketchy. That God does not require his covenant people to draw people to himself.
Yeah. Okay.
So that as Rob Bell famously asked in his very controversial book, Love Wins, well, what happens if the missionary gets a flat tire? What happens if a culture has never been reached? What happens to all the people before Jesus and all the people after Jesus who never heard of him? I mean, what about all those people? Right. What about the people that have horrible caricatures of Jesus because of what Christians have done? What about all those people?
Yeah.
So piece number 4. So piece number 1 is love of neighbor. Number 2 is we affirm truth wherever we find it. Piece number 3 is that we affirm beyond a shadow of a doubt that God is interested in the nations, not just in his narrow slice of followers. Mm-hmm. And that God moves beyond the boundaries of his covenants, of his covenant people. Now, we have no problem affirming this with the Old Testament, right? Because we have clear examples. We have Jonah being sent to the Ninevites, and the entire city repented. We have Ruth, who, as a Moabitess, goes to Israel, and it gets listed in the genealogy of Jesus. You've got Melchizedek, this strange character who's a priest of Yahweh, who Abraham comes across. And you're like, what? And you have countless examples. You have even some books just being reminded that outside of God's dealing with Israel, God is doing stuff on the human stage beyond Israel. Right. That is so unbelievably important. Second Chronicles puts it this way: for the eyes of the Lord range throughout the earth to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him. Boom. So, even when they're dedicating the temple, Solomon will pray, God, when the nations come here, please receive them. I mean, there was an awareness that, yes, God was uniquely relating to Israel, but that unique relationship was for the nations, and that God was relating to the nations directly himself. Mm-hmm. Make sense?
Yeah.
This is a very, very important point, because over and over and over again, we read that God is declaring himself through nature. We read God is declaring himself through revelation. We read that God is pursuing worshipers who worship him in spirit and in truth. And that God, more than anything, is looking for a certain kind of heart. And so Isaiah, these are the ones I look on with favor. Those who are humble and contrite in spirit and tremble at my word. Now, obviously, he means that in the covenant context, but as we'll see, there's a bigger context to all of those words too. See, the issue is that God very clearly calls his called people to be mirrors, to be magnets, to be witnesses. No question about it. But that God doesn't wait for them because they've always been part of the problem. God doesn't wait for them to get their act together before he starts reaching and pursuing and relentlessly calling out to people, no matter where they are, no matter where they've come from. And one of the best examples of this, several examples of this, come from the book of Acts. When the gospel, the movement of Jesus, gets translated from its Jewish roots to Gentile Hellenistic context, you keep coming across people who God has already been working with, but he's sending messengers to now. So the classic example is of a guy named Cornelius, and it's incredible. He was a Roman, again another Gentile, and Cornelius receives a vision. And at the same time, a guy named Peter, who was very zealously Jewish, received a vision that somehow they should both meet, and that Peter should explain the way of Jesus to Cornelius at Cornelius's house, which is a huge deal.
Yeah.
So Cornelius says to Peter 3 days ago. So Peter makes this journey, and it's a huge deal in the book of Acts. 3 days ago, I was in my house praying at this hour. At 3 p.m, this is Cornelius talking, and suddenly a man in shining clothes stood before me and said, Cornelius, God has heard your prayer and remembered your gifts to the poor. Now, this is before Cornelius has heard anything about Jesus.
Yeah.
Right? So this is God relating to Cornelius outside, right, of this particular Jesus movement. Yeah. But now, because Cornelius has a certain kind of heart, God sent Peter to go. And he said, I heard your prayer, remembered your gifts to the poor. Send to Joppa, which was a city down the road, for Simon, who is also called Peter. He's the house of Simon the tanner, who lives by the sea. So I sent for you immediately. It was good for you to come. Now we are here in the presence of God to listen to everything the Lord has commanded you to tell us. Here's Peter's response to that speech. I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism, but accepts from every nation the one who fears him and does what is right. Now that's interesting.
Yeah.
Right? Because this issue, think about this. The major issue, see, this conversation that Peter has with Cornelius provokes the very Jewish Jerusalem church to say, what the heck are you doing? And Peter has to go and defend himself back in Jerusalem about going to the house of this Gentile and seeing the Holy Spirit fall on this Gentile and the unmistakable blessing of God on this Gentile. And he has to go back and now explain what was this. And so he tells them about the vision. But this sets up a controversy that happens a few chapters later when there were Jewish people from Jerusalem insisting the only way to worship the Jewish Messiah was to become Jewish.
Oh yeah. Uh-huh.
So the earliest followers of Jesus struggled with the issue of whether or not people could be acceptable to God if they were not Jewish. Okay? The pluralism question is, can people be acceptable to God if they're not explicitly Christian? So you just go, okay, well, how many parallels can there be here? An acceptable Jew weren't just the right Jewish beliefs, but it was circumcision and observance of the law and the Sabbath and the dietary restrictions and right?
Yeah.
And so there were people walking around saying, no, you can only come to Jesus through Judaism.
Right.
So the question that we're wrestling with is, do you have to come to Jesus through Christianity? And the answer I want to say is no. Now, what God will do, in my view, is that God will either reveal himself to you directly or call someone to come and to share explicitly.
Right.
Like Cornelius, right? That was
Right.
pretty epic. But you hear, and I've talked to Muslims who have had dreams about Jesus.
Yeah. There's one specific one you told us like a month ago. That was either you read it and the guy jumped on a plane, like that story.
Yes. God revealing in a closed off Muslim country that they needed to meet the first white man that came off at a plane at a certain airport at a certain time, and revealing to a white man who was sitting around going, why are none of the other options for my trip working out, getting the idea that no, he needs to show up to this country and he doesn't know why. And then that whole thing just exploding, and you just go, okay, so does God need Christianity to reveal Jesus? Well, of course not. And so the idea that God is at work beyond what is explicitly Christian, I think is pretty clearly taught. Paul teaches it in Romans chapter 2. Oh my goodness, he's talking about a can of worms here. He's talking about how Jews and Gentiles alike stand unrighteously before God. Okay, so he condemns Gentile culture, pagan culture at the end of 1. And then he looks at the beginning of 2, and he says, and you who pass judgment on the Gentiles, you are guilty as well. And he begins to build a case against them. But notice, these raise so many questions. My goodness, this is so hard. He begins to say, and I know this is a lot of Bible, but holy cow. He says, to those who by persistence in doing good seek glory, honor, and immortality, God will give eternal life. But for those who are self-seeking, who reject the truth, follow evil, there will be wrath and anger, which gets back to our hell conversation that we're having. There will be trouble and distress for every human being who does evil, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. But glory, honor, and peace for everyone who does good, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. For God does not show favoritism. And this is where it gets wacky. All who sin apart from the law will also perish apart from the law, and those who sin under the law will be judged by the law. Now, apart from the law is Gentile, with the law or under the law is Jew. So he's saying, listen, we're all condemned equally, okay, before God. And then he says, for it is not those who hear the law who are righteous, but those who obey the law who are righteous. And then he adds this parenthesis that it raises so many questions. Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, at other times even defending them. Mm-hmm. All right?
Right.
So then, If those who are not circumcised, Gentiles, keep the law's requirements, will they not be regarded as though they were circumcised, namely righteous Jews? The one who is not circumcised physically and yet obeys the law will condemn you who, even though you have the written code and circumcision, are a lawbreaker. A person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor a circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not the written code. Good Lord! Now, do you see what... So Paul, and there's so much debate around this passage, Paul seems to be opening up the idea that it's possible to be acceptable to God apart from Judaism.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
And he seems to make the point that we've been making, which is God is looking for a certain kind of heart. And that God's search is for the hearts, certain kind of hearts of people, hearts that are open, hearts that are humble, whatever it is, and that God will make sure that those people are people who hear, receive, get blessed, get saved, get rescued, get whatever language you want to put it. Those people God will relentlessly search for and rescue. End of story. Even if it's apart from the covenant workings of a certain group of people. Mm-hmm. Make sense?
Yeah.
Now, one big disclaimer. I know this is so thick. I'm even feeling it like in the pacing of the podcast. I know it's so thick. One big disclaimer is that Paul's not saying that some such people have deserved their salvation. He's making the point that all salvation is by mercy. Why? Because all have fallen short. End of story. It's all rescue. It's all grace. But there are ways of determining hearts that are oriented towards the one true God.
Right.
Right? Regardless of whether or not those hearts are a part of the accepted and chosen religious communities.
Right.
That's the big point.
Yeah.
Okay, so oh my goodness. Okay, I got to make sure I'm saying this. Mm-hmm. God does not, it's not merit that's getting us in. It's not deserving that's getting us in. When God talks about what God does, even among flawed efforts to reach him, or even among flawed understandings of what he's like, what's God do? He reaches them. Do you understand? Mm-hmm. It's like, so people will say, hey, do Mormons go to heaven? Well, I don't know. I'm not. Do Muslims, do Buddhists, do Hindus? Well, I'm not prepared. I'm prepared to say that Jesus Christ was put forward as God's agent of reconciliation for heaven and earth and the healing of the nations. How Jesus Christ gets presented beyond the strictures of Christianity, I don't know. All I know is that there's enough hinting that I'm prepared to say I don't know.
Yeah.
Right? There's enough hinting that God is at work in the world among people who have flawed understandings of him, even Christians.
Yeah.
Correct?
I feel like it's actually a positive agenda that God will allow enough mystery and confusion over this matter so that we would not know. Like,
yes.
It feels like that kind of intentionality, being like, it would not be beneficial for you to actually be able to understand this.
Could you imagine the damage Christians would do, and they have done,
right,
with categorizing and just, nope, these people are out, these people are in the face of massive amounts of warning from the Bible against making those very judgments. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing that's so insane.
Right.
So to me, and then you get Paul, oh my goodness, later in Acts, Paul never goes to pagan nations and suggests that God has nothing to do with them. Okay? Yeah. He never, ever does that. Listen to his... So in one episode in Acts 14, Paul and his companion, I don't remember who it was, they heal somebody. And the people are so religious, they begin to shout at Paul and, I don't remember who, Barnabas. They begin to shout to them, the gods have come down to us in human form. Barnabas they called Zeus, Paul they called Hermes. And they brought bowls and wreaths to sacrifice to the Roman gods, because Paul and Barnabas had done this in the name of Jesus. Okay? Listen to what Paul says. Friends, why are you doing this? We too are human just like you. We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them. In the past, he let all nations go their own way. Yet he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy. That's interesting. So at some point, he let the nations go their own way, but testified about his reality through joy, food, rain, right?
Yeah.
That's just interesting. Or in Acts 17, when Paul is standing, hold on a second, it gets even crazier. When Paul is standing in Athens, all right, the cultural capital, the birthplace of mathematics and philosophy, the hotbed of Epicurean and Stoic debates, Paul gets up there and he says, I walked around today and looked at your objects of worship. So he affirms they're worshipers, right? And some estimate there were 10,000 statues, altars, more than the population of Athens were like altars and places of worship. So Paul said, I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship. I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this now is what I'm going to proclaim to you. So they worshiped. So Paul is saying, listen, they've worshiped in ignorance. Now Paul is going to set them straight. Okay?
Yeah.
But notice how he does it. The God that made the world and everything in it is Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he's not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. Now listen to this. From one man, Adam, he made the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands. And he did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. Well, there's a theology of the nations for you, right?
Yeah.
So first piece, love of neighbor. Second piece, we affirm truth wherever we find it. Third piece, I don't remember. Fourth piece,
nations,
theology of the nations. Fourth piece is God. Because God is so concerned about the nations, he doesn't wait for his people to get their act together. Oftentimes, he's working outside of their strictly religiousness,
right,
and their structures. Fifth one, and this is the most important one, my two brothers. The God revealed in Jesus would never, ever, ever condemn someone to the exile of hell, and we'll talk more about hell, who would have responded to God's invitation. There's nobody that misses it because, it was just by the skin of their teeth, or the missionary had the flat tire. There is not, the God revealed in Jesus wants no one to perish. The God revealed in Jesus is relentless, who will leave the 99 sheep and search for the one, who will search for the lost with the fervor of a woman who loses 9 coins has 10 coins, loses 1, puts the 9 away and tears her house apart looking for the 1 coin, and will receive every single wayward soul as a father receives a prodigal son. This is the God revealed in Jesus to me, and this is the answer. This is the answer to all. I realize there's so much theology and so much other stuff. This is the singular answer. The God revealed in Jesus would never be unfair. The God revealed in Jesus would never be unmerciful. The God revealed in Jesus is holy and righteous and just, yes, but at the same time makes ways for people to be reconciled with God. End of story. So I cannot say with any definitive confidence who's in and who's out. The only confidence I'm given is that the God of the earth will do right. The God revealed to us in Jesus of Nazareth is relentless in his pursuit of every single human person on the planet. End of story. I don't know if we get second chances after death. I have no idea. There's some passages that seem to say no. There's some passages that seem to open it up. I don't know. I have no idea. I hope everybody ends up in the heavens. I hope every single person gets there after God does his purifying work in them. So some of us show up in heaven with very large souls. Some of us show up with very small ones. And even this language isn't right, because we're talking about the new heavens and the new earth and God purging evil and so on, so on, so on. But I hope, and I know it's the tritest answer, but to me it's the most important, and that's why I wanted to do it last. My confidence in God's love and fairness and goodness does not rest on the Old Testament. It does not rest on people's questions about the Old Testament. It rests on the person of Jesus Christ. Because Jesus, according to Jesus in the New Testament, is the clearest revelation of the Father. So I don't understand how all of it fits together. I don't understand how all of it works. I just know if we're going to approach the question about Jesus being the only way, and we're going to quote verses like, "There's no other name given under heaven by which men can be saved," or Jesus saying, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Great. I have no issue with any of those things. But notice who we're talking about. Jesus is also the Word through which the universe was created. Jesus evidently holds all things into being. Jesus evidently is cosmic in nature and scope, as well as particular as a human person. So you have this consistent tension between God using his covenant people to expand his kingdom and God not being limited by the covenant people to do the work that God wants to do.
Right. But that seems to affirm the idea of cooperative participants. It's kind of like God's like, I'm doing this larger, bigger thing. And the fact that he gave an entryway to have participation, that seems like the grace and blessing.
Right.
Because otherwise he's like, well, I'm going to be doing this work. And it's like, but it would be significantly better to have those with me that I've created doing it with me. Like that is such a different picture of love. Otherwise, it's just puppeteering.
That's right. Because God initially intended for the earth to be governed by human persons.
Yeah.
So when the human persons become fallen, God not only assumes the form of a human person, but then invites the redeemed humans in on the work. Absolutely what you're saying. It's just the problem when the redeemed humans begin to believe that they're indispensable to the work.
Yes.
And they take the narrow, high-minded, exclusive posture that Israel sometimes embodied about their being the chosen ones and God having to continually remind them, no, my work is far beyond, right, your authoritative structures.
Yeah.
And so there's a humility and a chastisement that I feel when I think about these things. Because on the one hand, do I think following Jesus of Nazareth leads to flourishing and freedom and liberation and joy? Absolutely. Absolutely. I want that for everybody. I literally want that for everybody. I don't want the caricature for everybody. I don't want the narrow, I mean, to me, following Jesus has made me bigger and more loving, and he's transformed me and just da-da-da-da. So all that religious, I follow Jesus because I believe it to the core of my bones. I've tasted it. I've felt it. I've seen it. I've studied it. I love it. I have all sorts of questions and doubts that remain unanswered, but it's like marriage. But in spite of all that, man, I just run after this guy over and over and over again, and would love for every single listener to have a similar experience. Yeah. Absolutely. And so on the one hand, that's how passionate I'm about it. But on the other hand, there's a humbleness that says, no. Jesus never manipulated. He never coerced. He never browbeat people. He never threatened them with hell. He never manipulated them with promises. He invited people, and that was it. Yeah. And then trusted that the Father's always at work.
Right.
And so I want to take that same posture. So hey, can Muslims go to heaven? Sure. I have no idea. I don't know how it works. I do know that the heart that was most closed to Jesus was the religious heart. And so, because people say, what about the devout Muslim or the devout Buddhist or whatever? And you just go, well, sometimes the more devout you are, the more closed off you become.
Yeah.
So I don't know. The religious heart is the one that seems to have the most trouble with Jesus, whereas the scandalous, immoral, impure heart is the one that seems most open. And so I just have no idea. I just surprise and reversal characterize the judgment. I just would be thrilled if I'm in. I would just be thrilled. I want in. I want to sit at the feast with people from every tongue and tribe and nation. That to me sounds pretty freaking awesome.
Yeah.
So I have enough trouble worrying about me. The second thing is, To be able to love my neighbor, I engage in something called multi-faith dialogue versus interfaith dialogue. Interfaith dialogue is when we're all trying to minimize our differences so we can maximize our common ground. To me, I'm much more interested in multi-faith dialogue, which is tell me everything about what you think and what you're passionate about. And let's talk about areas of agreement and disagreement both, so that neither one of us has to soften or color in order for us to get along.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? I don't want Muslims to have to soften their Islam in order to engage with Christians. In the same way, I don't want Christians to have to soften their Christianing to engage with other folks from other religions. Love of neighbor does not require uniformity of belief, correct? Mm-hmm. And so to me, I find this when I talk to Jewish people, I talk to them as Jewish people, not potential converts, but as Jewish people. I'm fascinated by this. Tell me everything, right? When I talk to Muslims, I'm not talking to them as anything other than Muslims.
Right.
Tell me.
Well, it's funny. I thought about this even with like our LGBTQ conversation last week. I was just like, when do we stop treating other people like they're our mission field? You know, it's like if especially in the conversation of the nations and what God is doing in other nations, there's a sense in me personally that feels like going places and doing exactly what you said in a multi-faith conversation allows God to show up a lot differently than
Absolutely.
Thinking I'm going to be the one that fully embodies everything that God is supposed to be. And when I show up, that's when God's there.
Right.
Yeah. That just doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make any sense. And it radically, I just don't see a lot of us approaching culture from a position of peace and grace and security and confidence. I just see us doing a lot of fear, a lot of anger, being threatened. And when you come at people from that space, right, all you can do is attack and defend. And so for me, I try to come from a different space to say, listen, of course I believe it's true. Of course I would want everybody to taste what I've tasted. Of course, come on. Yes. But that conviction does not lead me to beat people up, to shame or blame or, make them afraid or whatever. It leads me to actually just to the reverse, which is, how would I want to be treated? Do I like being the object of evangelism, right? So I can hear conservative Christians being upset about this view.
Yeah.
But then I go, okay, so let's say you have a family member who's relentlessly pursuing you to affirm gay marriage. Do you like that? Do you like being nitpicked in or guilted in, or, hey, you're going to be on the wrong side of history in? I mean, does that work? It doesn't work. And so if love of neighbor, and that's why we start there, is treating people the way I would want to be treated.
Yeah.
That means, first, I'm called to live such a compelling life that I shouldn't have to say a freaking word.
Yeah.
Secondly, I don't come at people as projects. I don't come at people as witnessing opportunities. I don't come at people as counting or guilt, trying to get God off my back because, here's someone I led to Jesus, right? That's just not how this works.
Yeah.
I've found, and the most surprising thing for in my life as a recovering pastor has been that to get to know people as a sincere, normal human being, genuinely interested and invested in who they are as they are and what they're interested in as they're interested in it, will naturally provoke all sorts of wonderful conversations that come from a position of trust and safety, rather than this just relentless need that people have to get rescue souls and get them into heaven. God is more interested in your family member, in your children, in your spouse, in your neighbor than you are. So there's a privilege here, and of course a responsibility. I take the responsibility to be a witness to the resurrected Jesus incredibly seriously. But that responsibility never leads me to, at least I try not to let it lead me to a place of superiority, a place of exclusion, a place of whatever. I'm just not in the position to know how God is going to apply Jesus to the world. I don't know. I keep coming across too many Muslims who have dreams of Jesus and come to faith in Jesus, but they're not in Christian contexts. They're still in Muslim contexts.
Yeah.
So do they have a relationship with Jesus? Right? People will say, hey, can I be saved in the Catholic Church? I'm like, really? Nowhere does it say you have to have it all lined up before you're acceptable to God. See, this is the result of American believism. So we've made following Jesus about being right. So anyone that's right because of the logical exclusivism of right and wrong, then we have to say everyone else is wrong. I don't see Jesus playing that same thing. I just see him operating. He's looking for a kind of heart, regardless of whether or not your doctrine is perfect. Right? So, will there be Mormons in heaven? I wouldn't shock me. Jehovah's Witnesses wouldn't shock me. Members of Afghanistan, tribesmen from Afghanistan to whom God appeared. Yes, I just will be shocked and surprised at who's in and who's out. So I think there's a humility and a responsibility in all this. Now, frick, that's a lot of talking.
Next 5 points.
No, we are so done. But again, this is where I want to nuance everything and say, no, but then there's this, and then there's this, and then there's this. So back to where we started. My two brothers, the one brother that emailed and the other brother that asked. I hope this stirs up some great conversation between the two of you. That's the goal. I am still very much in process on so many things. Convicted of, absolutely convinced on the beauty and majesty of Jesus. But the outworking of all of that, I find it delightful to wrestle and to think and to study and to pray and to be wrong and to whatever else. And so this is joy. I hope it becomes joy for you. It does not have to be awful to sit and have these wonderful conversations. So to the degree something like this helps, we are absolutely honored and thrilled. And we realize that in the podcast form, there's all sorts of things that are still questions and all sorts of nuances we didn't give. But we just are going to leave it here. We're going to drop it like it's hot.
Yep.
Like Snoop Dogg would encourage us to.
And that's why we give you an email. hello@voxpodcast.com.
Yes.
It's why you can follow us on Twitter at the Vox Podcast.
Yes.
And like us on Facebook, facebook.com/VoxPodcast.
Bless us.
Yeah. And ask more questions.
Oh, all right. So let's close, just because it's Christmas time, with a little different blessing. All right?
Okay.
Tiny Tim put it best when he said, what's he say? And God bless us.
God bless us every single one of us.
Okay, yeah. Here we go. All right. I was questioning the wording for a second. Is that what he says? And God bless us every single one of us?
May God bless us every single one of us. Like, it's emphasized like that. Okay. Well, now we got to look it up.
Okay,
making
all right.
it weird.
I know, seriously. I want to get this right. The blessing, guys, the blessing matters. The blessing matters.
It matters.
Yeah, so God bless us everyone.
Oh, I'm Tiny Tim.
See, I thought it was God bless us everyone. That's what's sounding right to me right now. All right, hurry up.
It's almost there.
Come on.
Video quote, God bless us, everyone. God bless
is that what it is?
That's what the YouTube looks like it's saying.
Nice. You just want to play.
Wait, here it is. And
okay.
So, hold on. I think I got. And so, as Tiny Tim said, a Merry Christmas to us all. God bless us, everyone.
There you go. Hey, I hope that was worth the wait. Talk about underwhelming. All right, brothers and sisters. God bless us, everyone. Until next time.
Hey, thanks for listening to the Vox Podcast. Learn more about us at voxpodcast.com. Follow us on Twitter at the Vox Podcast, and now support us on Patreon at patreon.com/voxpodcast.